Watching SABC News Prime Time. UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon says Africa has an enormous stake in the success of the COP21 climate change summit. He has chaired a high-level meeting of African countries as thousands of delegates continue negotiations in Paris. Some 40,000 delegates are thrashing out details inside a draft agreement. Britain's Prince Charles also addressed the summit. He said accelerated action to stop deforestation is needed now more than ever. There was also a high-level meeting of African delegates, including South Africa. Environment Minister Edna Molewa says agreements must be reached. The continent's success when it comes to green technology and cutting emissions rests largely on much-needed financial agreements with developed nations. Let's catch up on the latest at the summit with SABC correspondent Dan Whitehead in Paris. Dan, President Obama has wrapped up his press briefing. Prince Charles also addressed delegates. Talk us through what they had to say.
Well, President Obama heading back to Washington tonight and giving that wrapping up press conference, leaving that lasting message, as inspirational, really, many will say, as his opening message yesterday, saying that a deal here at COP21 among the 190 countries is a security and economic imperative. He said that it will spur innovation if leaders manage to lock down real legally binding agreements here, saying that it will boost the economy and help the planet at the same time. He also held a meeting with island states, referring to himself as an island boy, referring to his time growing up in Hawaii, understanding that island states are particularly vulnerable to the effects of climate change and promising more help for those island states. Prince Charles, though, kicked off day two here, of course, the strong advocate for the climate change campaign. Britain's Prince Charles giving a speech in terms of deforestation, saying that there is no plan B and that deforestation must end, referring to figures that the world's forests can help mitigate a third of the carbon dioxide emissions which are causing so much of the problems which are trying to be solved here, and urging more to be done to protect the around 1 billion people whose livelihoods depend on the world's forests. Those are two of the big speeches which have taken place here at COP21. The leaders, most of them now have left. It's going down now to the 40,000 or so delegates and attendees who are crunching those numbers and going through a draft agreement which has already been published, more than 50 pages of it, but it's full of compromises and it's full of contradictions. That needs to be whittled down over the next 2 weeks until next Friday, when hopefully they'll have a final draft with some real agreements.
Dan, there was also a high-level African meeting that took place. It was chaired by UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. What came out of that meeting? I'm wondering about the African position.
The French President François Hollande also chairing that meeting. Ban Ki-moon saying that African countries have, as you heard there in the lead-up, an enormous stake in the success of COP21. He highlighted that Africa is particularly vulnerable to climate change, of course, agriculture being susceptible to those drastic changes in climate. Ban Ki-moon going on to say that any disruption to food and water supplies in African countries pose a real threat to political and economic stability. So perhaps nowhere more is the urgency of climate change and a solution to it present than Africa. And we heard from President Zuma say it last night, saying that developed countries must do more to help African nations and fellow developing countries in terms of finance to do more. A positive note, though, from Ban Ki-moon as well, saying that sustainable energy and the introduction of that technology does offer huge economic benefits for those thriving and growing economies in Africa. So there's a message there to embrace these technologies, these new green renewable energies. President Jacob Zuma told me last night that nuclear energy as well as solar are the two areas which South Africa is particularly looking at increasing, and that was the message from the very high-level delegate meeting of African countries earlier this morning.
Dan, you're in Paris. Very briefly, coming on the back of the recent Paris attacks, what's the security situation like there?
Well, security remains tight. There are around 11,000 police officers which have been deployed as part of COP21. 2,800 of those are physically at the site here, around 15 minutes north of the centre of Paris. The other 8,000 are carrying out extra security checks. Members of the military are also posted around the site here. Inside the bubble of COP21, you perhaps wouldn't notice, but officials do say that there was no major change after the Paris attacks a couple of weeks ago in terms of the security arrangements here. Yesterday, of course, the biggest gathering ever of the number of UN heads of state in one place. And when you have that many world leaders gathering on one venue, then security, of course, is going to be incredibly tight anyway. But the presence will remain here, of course, until the summit ends next Friday. There are still very high-level delegates, ministers coming from all of those countries, so security remains prominent.
That was our correspondent Dan Whitehead coming to us live from COP21 in Paris.